Well, the election, that was something. I think for most people, the past year has felt a bit like the anticipation of an oncoming hurricane. And a lot of us cringed our teeth in the months and weeks leading up to it. And like a hurricane, some were devastated with the outcome, and others were elated that the storm's path went their way. I find myself a bit more on the former side of things, but that's not really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what is the best way for us to move forward from here. What is the best way to respond? Because I think if there's anything we can still agree on, it's that we're extremely and intensely divided. And I would say divided to a dangerously toxic degree. Now, it's natural and even healthy in a democracy to disagree and have differing viewpoints. But what's unhealthy is when that disagreement grows and distorts and metastasizes to a point where we can't even discuss those differences, when it rather causes us to see the other side as fundamentally evil. Because when we get to that point, history gives us a pretty grim warning of the outcome. Violence, war, death, genocide, and a whole litany of possible human atrocities. And as much as we might feel justified in our anger in times like this, almost all of us can agree that we don't want any of those outcomes. Now, I get the instinctual pushback many have here that this election was fundamentally different. I recognize the reaction many have when it comes to the frankly unprecedented personality Donald Trump has thrown into American politics. And I understand and in large part even personally agree with the position that his rhetoric, his moral compass or lack thereof, and his dubious intellect and respect for the Constitution are fundamentally unacceptable. And so I understand the temptation to ask, how do you move forward with someone like that? And how do you move forward with those who support that? But the fact is, 75 million people, well over half of the country, voted for him. And those 75 million people didn't quite see things that way. So I think for the well-being of my community, my relationships, and my own personal well-being, I simply cannot subscribe to the belief that 75 million people, including a large chunk of my own family, are fundamentally unacceptable or evil people. So then, how do we respond? How do you respond to circumstances and opinions that appear to be so obviously flawed? Anyone who has the benefit of friends or family, and especially family with differing political views, has likely at some point found themselves within one of the infamous, sensitive, temperature-escalating, relationship-straining political arguments, or at best a heated political debate. And regardless of how informed or evidence-based your positions may be, everyone who has experienced this also realizes they don't work. Minds and hearts are rarely changed and enlightened in the heat of intellectual or rhetorical battle. It's here where I've been thinking about the wisest examples I know of, not just in history, but literature as well. The Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Gandhis, the Dalai Lamas, the Albus Dumbledores, the Gandalfs. And I've been wondering how they'd respond to these circumstances we find ourselves in. I thought about Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi's use of nonviolent resistance in the face of violent oppression. I thought of Dumbledore's recognition of Harry's ability to love to be what ultimately helps him overcome Voldemort. I thought of Gandalf's belief in small, humble hobbits being the ones that ultimately saved Middle-earth from the power of darkness. Each of these characters utilized a non-obvious but nonetheless powerful kind of judo move that enabled them to overcome the challenges of their time, that enabled them to transcend over the storm and navigate towards a brilliant outcome that seemed invisible before. And I think this moment we're in is calling for something similar in us? What is the enlightened, transcendent, judo-like move this moment calls for? As I've been thinking a lot about this since the election recently, one word keeps coming to mind: compassion. Now, I know compassion for those on the other side of the divide, for those who voted in support of unacceptable positions and policies, may feel like the last impulse you feel inclined towards. It feels completely counterintuitive, but I think that's exactly what makes it the same type of wisdom those other characters displayed. I also think first and foremost, it's important to recognize compassion doesn't mean capitulation. It doesn't mean compromising or relinquishing your values or deeply held beliefs. Instead, compassion is about, as a first step, acknowledging the humanity in others. It's about recognizing that the viewpoints of others, even when they're diametrically opposed to yours, often come from deeper desires similar to our own. Desires of living a happy life and creating a brighter, better world. And it allows us to more clearly see the fears others feel when those desires appear threatened. Compassion enables us to see that while we visibly may be miles apart on issues, under the surface, our roots reach for the same life source. Compassion allows us to better understand others, and in so doing, refines our own views and ultimately opens the hearts of others. Now, you may be saying, okay, I get it. In theory, compassion may be great, but what does that actually mean in the moment-to-moment conversations where I feel like my heart is on furious fire and my head is about to explode? So here, I think I have some practical ideas of how to put compassion into practice. 1, lead with curiosity rather than judgment. I think an essential part of compassion is the element of curiosity. Curiosity also feels like the last color in the crayon box to reach for, especially these days when we're often eclipsed in a haze of anger and frustration. But you can't facilitate an approachable conversation, and you can't cultivate understanding with others without a bit of curiosity. Instead of entering a conversation with your list of convictions locked and loaded, rather approach it with questions to open up the floor, such as, what led you to believe this or feel this way? What experiences or concerns shaped your view here on immigration or gender identification? These types of questions can turn a stalemated debate into a potentially meaningful conversation. This kind of approach has the ability to disarm defensiveness and open the hearts of others. Beginning with questions and a genuine open mind and deep listening can create the space for genuine, impactful dialogue that we need. 2, acknowledge their emotional reality. Often when asking questions, you'll quickly run into the emotions underlying those political views and opinions. And often in today's climate, our first impulse is to dismiss those emotions or point out how they're unfounded or based on misinformation. Instead, try first recognizing their emotions. Maybe saying, that makes sense why you feel that way. Or, I can see this is something you care deeply about, and I understand why you'd feel that way. This shows that you recognize their emotions, which can help them feel heard and respected, even if you don't share their perspective or disagree with the information their emotions are rising from. When people feel heard and respected, they're more likely to be open to discussion and hearing other points of view like your own. 3, find common ground. Like I said earlier, even in the face of stark disagreement on policies, persons, or programming, I think if you look deeper under the surface, many of our desires share common roots. Hence, it's often wise to start from a common ground, emphasizing our similarities, which we're biologically programmed to gravitate to for safety and community. For instance, maybe saying something like, "We may have different views on how to fix this, but I think we both can agree that all people deserve fair treatment and an opportunity." Or, "I hear you, and though I'm not sure I share that specific perspective, I do agree that you should have the opportunity to feel safe and secure." Our minds are wired to cling to beliefs that make us feel part of a tribe. This sense of identity is incredibly powerful, offering comfort and belonging. And finding common ground allows us to tap into this, reminding us that we have more in common than what sets us apart. Deep down, we all value similar core things, such as fairness, freedom, and well-being for ourselves, families, and communities. By starting with what we share in common, we enable each other to see the threads of validity in other perspectives, and hence allow us to find the common solutions to the issues that we face. 4. Practice pausing before responding, not reacting. Inevitably, any political conversation is likely to have a provocateur. And when that moment comes, when someone says something incendiary, take a moment to pause before responding. This can be as simple as taking a breath or saying, okay, interesting. These conversations often run off the rails when we react rather than thoughtfully respond. By taking a pause, we offer ourselves a space between that provoking stimuli and our response, which can thus be a response of compassion rather than instinctive defensiveness or indignation. Pausing also signals that you're listening and considering their words. By pausing, you establish yourself as an honest listener, an earnest thinker, and ultimately a leader in the kind of peaceful, thoughtful civil discourse we so deeply need these days. 5. Don't be afraid to set boundaries. Sometimes provocative comments can become too much. And sometimes our emotions can get so raised up to the point where we lose access to our calmer, wiser, and more grounded selves. If a conversation is getting there and becoming too intense, compassion can look like respectfully choosing not to engage any further. You could say, "I appreciate you sharing your perspective, but I'm just not in the best place to discuss this any further right now." Setting boundaries is itself an act of compassion, one that respects other person's emotional well-being. 6. Express gratitude for the conversation. Like in any interview, date, or social setting, how you end an interaction determines its lasting emotional residue or the feeling someone will be left with. Hence, it's helpful at the end of a conversation to thank the other person for engaging with you. Something as simple as, "Thanks for sharing your perspective with me. I've learned a lot from hearing where you're coming from." Expressing gratitude, even when you haven't agreed on anything, reinforces a sense of respect and openness that leaves the parties with a positive feeling. It's this kind of closing note that signals the conversation and the relationship can continue in a healthy, peaceful way despite any differences. Showing compassion in conversation is not about abandoning your beliefs. It's about creating space for genuine connection and understanding and ultimately healthy progress. Thinking back on the characters of Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Dumbledore, and Gandalf, I would say that compassion was absolutely at the core of their revolutionary impact and influence. Responding to the 2024 election with compassion won't erase the very real differences we have, nor will it completely solve the difficult emotions and problems we face. But It will help us resist the cycles of outrage that leaves so many of us exhausted and disillusioned and even further divided. Compassion and curiosity empower us to stay engaged without becoming hardened or radicalized. Because in the end, outrage and indignation without compassion is a dead end. It's how relationships crumble, families fracture, and nations fall. Compassion, however, opens doors to a higher plane. It magically creates space where understanding can happen and where peace can blossom, even if through the invisible cracks in the hardened asphalt we currently find ourselves now. Showing compassion establishes you as a leader of a culture that values truth, intelligence, thoughtfulness, empathy, and peace. A leader towards a better world we all long for. In the face of the national and global challenges that daunt us now, acts of compassion can seem futile and small, but in the words of Gandalf the Great,
Mithrandi. Why the halfling?
I do not know. Saruman believes that it is only a great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love. Why, Bilbo Baggins? Perhaps it is because I'm afraid. It gives me courage.